On March 13th, 1932, a fire broke out inside one of the most beautiful castles in France. The flames started near the newly installed central heating system inside the Château de la Mothe-Chandeniers, a neo-Gothic masterpiece surrounded by a moat in the Loire Valley countryside. By the time firefighters arrived from across the region, the blaze had already torn through the grand halls, the library, the tapestries, and the paintings that had decorated the castle for generations. They managed to save the chapel, a few outbuildings, and a small dovecote tower. But the castle itself, the heart of the estate, was gutted. Nobody rebuilt it. Nobody came back. For the next 85 years, La Mothe-Chandeniers sat in silence while the forests of western France slowly consumed it. Trees pushed through the stone window frames, ivy crawled across the turrets, moss blanketed the grand staircases, and the castle that once hosted some of the finest parties in French aristocratic society became quite literally a skeleton wrapped in green. If you're into forgotten places like this, castles, ruins, and stories that history tried to bury, make sure you subscribe, because some of these places are even darker than this one. But to understand why this place was left to rot for nearly a century, you need to go back to the very beginning. Because the fire in 1932 was not the first time La Mothe-Chandeniers was abandoned. It was not even the second. This castle has been built up and torn down, loved and forgotten, more times than almost any building in Europe. And every single time, the same pattern repeats. Someone falls in love with it, someone pours everything they have into it, and then something goes terribly wrong. The story starts in the early 1200s in the commune of Les Trois-Moutiers, about 200 miles southwest of Paris. The Balquet family, powerful lords in the region, built a medieval fortress on a patch of elevated ground surrounded by marshland. It wasn't beautiful, it wasn't meant to be. This was a military structure designed to control the surrounding territory and withstand siege, and it was tested almost immediately. During the 100 Years' War between England and France, La Mothe-Chandeniers was captured by English forces on at least 2 separate occasions. The castle changed hands through violence, diplomacy, and marriage over the next 2 centuries, eventually passing to the Rochechouart-Chandelier family through a union between Marie de Bouquet and Guillaume de Chauny in 1404. The Rochechouarts would rename the estate and hold it for nearly 300 years. But the most dramatic chapter of their ownership began in 1654, when Marquis François II de Rochechouart-Chandeliers was exiled from the royal court. François had backed the wrong side during the Fronde, a series of civil wars that tore through France in the mid-1600s. The king banished him to the countryside, and François chose La Mothe as his place of exile. The problem was that the castle was already falling apart. Centuries of warfare and neglect had reduced the medieval fortress to little more than crumbling walls and empty rooms. So François did what exiled aristocrats often do when they have too much pride and too little oversight. He rebuilt the entire place into an extravagant residence, complete with sprawling gardens and manicured parks. For a few years, it was magnificent. François held court there, entertaining guests and living as if he were still in the orbit of the king. But the spending caught up with him. His debts mounted until he had no choice but to surrender the estate to his creditors. La Mothe-Chandeniers was abandoned again. The castle passed through a series of aristocratic families over the next 150 years, including the Lamoignon and Maupeou dynasties. René Charles de Maupeou, who served as vice-chancellor and keeper of the seals under Louis XV, held the property through his wife's inheritance. But none of these families actually lived there. The castle sat neglected through most of the 1700s, slowly decaying. Then came the French Revolution. The estate was damaged, though the historical record is vague on exactly how badly. What we know is that by the early 1800s, La Mothe-Chandeniers was once again a ruin, abandoned, forgotten. That changed in 1809 when a wealthy Parisian businessman named Francois Hennequart purchased the estate. Hennequart invested heavily in restoring the castle, trying to bring back some echo of its former grandeur. His efforts stabilized the structure, but the real transformation came decades later. In 1857, the property passed to Baron Joseph Lejeune. It was Joseph's son, Baron Edgard Lejeune, who would give La Mothe-Chandeniers its most famous identity. Around 1870, Edgard launched a massive reconstruction campaign that completely reimagined the castle in the romantic neo-Gothic style that was sweeping across Europe at the time. The inspiration, according to historical accounts, was Ludwig II of Bavaria, the king who built the world-famous Neuschwanstein Castle in Germany. Edgard Lejeune wanted his own fairy tale, and for a while he got one. The rebuilt La Mothe-Chandeniers featured soaring turrets, pointed arches, flying buttresses, ribbed vaults, and colorful stained glass windows in the chapel. The interiors were filled with rare books, antique furniture, tapestries, and paintings collected over generations. The grounds were landscaped with gardens and walking paths that wound around the moat. And the parties. Baron Lejeune was known throughout the region for throwing lavish gatherings at the estate. The castle that had been a military outpost, a political exile's refuge, and an aristocratic afterthought was finally, for the first time in its 600-year history, living up to its potential. But this golden age lasted barely 60 years. On the morning of March 13, 1932, something went wrong with the central heating system that had recently been installed in the castle. The fire spread fast. By the time word reached the nearest fire stations and crews arrived from surrounding towns, the damage was catastrophic. Le Figaro, one of France's most prominent newspapers, reported on the devastation. The owner's entire library of rare books was gone. Antique furniture that had survived centuries of ownership changes was destroyed. Tapestries and paintings, irreplaceable artifacts of French aristocratic culture, were reduced to ash. The firefighters fought the blaze for hours, but the best they could do was save the stone chapel, a few peripheral buildings, and the Dovecote Tower that still stands today. The damages were estimated at several million francs. In 1932, with the Great Depression crushing economies across Europe, there was no money to rebuild. The Lejeune family walked away. What followed was the longest period of abandonment in the castle's already troubled history. For 3 decades, La Mothe-Chandeniers sat empty. The roofless walls were exposed to rain, snow, and wind. Seeds carried by birds and weather took root in the cracks between stones. Saplings grew into full trees inside what used to be bedrooms and ballrooms. The moat, once a carefully maintained feature of the estate, became a still green pool, reflecting a castle that was slowly disappearing into the forest. In 1963, a retired industrialist named Jules Cavroy purchased the surrounding estate of 2,000 hectares, including 1,200 hectares of forest. But Cavroy was interested in farming the land, not saving the castle. The ruin continued to deteriorate. Then, in 1981, a secondary school math teacher named Marc Deyemer bought La Mothe-Chandeniers. Deyemer had a dream. He wanted to restore the castle to something resembling its former glory. He spent 2 years working on preservation efforts, pouring his own time and money into a structure that had been decaying for nearly half a century. It was not enough. The scale of the damage was beyond what one person could fix. Nature had already claimed too much. Trees had grown so deeply into the stone walls that removing them would risk collapsing entire sections. The cost of professional restoration ran into the millions, and Deyemer had the salary of a math teacher. Years later, in an interview, Deyemer admitted how close he came to giving up entirely. He considered having the castle officially declared a ruin so that it could be demolished. 32 years of ownership, and the building had only gotten worse. But demolition never came. Instead, something nobody expected happened. In 2017, a French startup called D'Artagnans, which specialized in crowdfunding campaigns for historic buildings, partnered with an association called Adapter un Château. Together they launched what would become the largest crowdfunding campaign ever organized for a cultural heritage site. The pitch was simple: For 50 euros, about $58, you could become a co-owner of a 13th century French castle. You would receive shares in a company created to manage the property. You would get free admission for life, and you would have a vote in every major decision about the castle's future. The campaign went viral. Within 40 days, they had raised over 500,000 euros, enough to purchase the castle from Daimler. But the donations kept coming. Contributors poured in from over 115 countries. Teachers, students, retirees, architects, history lovers, people who had never set foot in France but could not resist the idea of owning a piece of a fairy tale ruin. By the time the first campaign closed, nearly 25,000 people had become co-owners. A second campaign followed, and then a third. Total fundraising eventually surpassed 3.6 million euros. The Château de la Mothe-Chandeniers held the world record for the largest crowdfunding total ever raised for a castle. Romain Delhomme, the co-founder of D'Artagnan's, described the project as proof of what people can accomplish through the internet and collective action. The idea was not just to raise money, it was to build a community around a shared piece of heritage. Every co-owner had a say. Every decision was made democratically. If 1,000 owners wanted red carpet in the hallway and 2,000 wanted blue, they would vote on it. That was the whole point. Since the purchase, more than 125 volunteer work camps have been organized at the site. Local construction companies have partnered on major structural stabilization. The castle grounds have been cleared, paths rebuilt, and the property open to the public. More than 40,000 visitors have walked through the estate, exploring the chapel, the grounds, and the haunting shell of the main building where trees still grow through what used to be windows. Eco-lodges were built in the surrounding woods, offering overnight stays with views of the illuminated castle ruins. An orangery was constructed for events. A gift shop was opened in partnership with local craftsmen who created a book and even a wine bearing the chateau's name. Seasonal events draw crowds throughout the year. But here's the thing about La Mothe-Chandeniers that makes it different from every other abandoned castle story you have ever heard. The people who saved it are not trying to erase what happened. They are not rebuilding it to look like it did in 1870. The trees growing through the stone walls, the ivy consuming the turrets, the moss on the grand staircases, that is part of the identity now. The ruin is the attraction. What La Mothe-Chandeniers has become is something that did not exist before 2017. Not a restored monument, not a museum, not a theme park. It is a living ruin, collectively owned by tens of thousands of people who will never all meet each other, maintained by volunteers who show up because they want to, and visited by anyone willing to pay a few euros to walk through the strangest and most beautiful collision of architecture and nature in France. The castle was built to withstand siege. It was rebuilt to host parties. It burned in a single night, and for 85 years, nobody came. Now nearly 28,000 people own it, and the doors are open. If stories like this one fascinate you, hit subscribe. I cover the world's most forgotten places and the dark histories hiding behind their walls every single week. And if you want to see another building that nature tried to erase from the map, that video is on screen right now.